Hi everyone, welcome back to another build series. This one's going to be Ensky's paper theater number W-02 called Acorn. And this is another Totoro series, and this is a special model because instead of just layers of paper, you're actually going to have wood pieces also. So it's actually layers of wood, and you're going to finish it off with a paper layer. And it's very interesting. It's actually simpler than the other paper models because you have the rigid wood pieces that actually help guide where to place it. So it's actually a little bit simpler than the other ones, and I thought that this was a really interesting model, which I really enjoyed making. So as you can see here, you have your base layers that are going to be in wood, and then thinner wood layer that's going to be the layers that you add on top of it, and then the paper layer that you're going to be adding on to finish it. So now that we're ready to go, let's get started. So I didn't know if I should be classifying this as a paper model, just because with the other paper theater series, it's actually made out of layers of paper that you're gluing together. But in this case, it's kind of a hybrid where it's not really a wood model, it's not really a paper model, but a mixture of both. And so with the normal ones that you've seen before for the paper theater, I've been actually using Mod Podge with a brush to get a small thin layer of glue on. But since it's actually wood pieces, I wanted to make sure that I actually had a more substantial glue, that I ended up using tacky glue that I'm squeezing onto it. So in this build, I actually forego the paintbrush completely and just used this tacky glue instead. So with the wood series paper theater, the interesting thing is that the actual frame is smaller than the other paper theaters, and it's smaller by I think like half an inch on both sides. So it is a smaller build, but it was actually easier just because, as you can see, the pieces that I'm gluing on are mostly wood, and the wood was actually easier to handle because it can actually take a little bit more roughness. So it was a little bit more forgiving. The only part that I really wanted to concentrate on was making sure that the paper layer that I'm applying above was straight and it was done correctly and very cleanly. And so it was actually an easier build overall, and I really do enjoy this. And I think if you're kind of timid about starting working on one of these paper theater series, I would definitely suggest trying to go with one of the wood series, just because the difficulty level is a lot easier than the typical paper theater. I have to say I am really impressed with the quality of this model set, and one of the things I really admired was that the paper, the colors that were chosen for this paper actually did go well with the wood, because sometimes if you're working with certain types of woods or paper, the colors might clash a little bit. But in this case, all the colors were on the warm tone side, and tonally they were all very complementary to the wood finish itself. So nothing really stood out, and it was actually meant more as an accent color to the wood instead of trying to create a whole finished layer of colors. A little tip that I'd like to share with these paper theater series in general, or actually any paper modeling, is that a lot of times you're going to have these little slits or openings, and if you want to make it look very clean, usually I would use like an X-Acto knife or a toothpick to kind of get what's in the hole and kind of take out the excess glue. Because a lot of times when you're gluing on the pieces of paper, the glue will seep out a little bit and it will actually fill up the gaps a little bit, and you want those gaps to be clean and deep with no glue or anything filled inside, and that actually gives you a harder contrast for the dark areas, and that actually makes the whole model look cleaner and more tightened up. And if you're not familiar with this series, this one is of Totoro, or My Friendly Neighbor Totoro, and this is actually an animated movie from a long time ago that was made by Studio Ghibli, and it was directed and created by Miyazaki Hayao. And I just love how he creates these designs for these animals or these spiritual characters that don't really exist in real life, and it's very imaginative and it's very detailed. and you a lot of times have very exaggerated facial expressions. And I just love his artwork and his movies because it is very imaginative. It is very different from the other types of animation we're used to, where they're mostly based off of some kind of reality, where I feel like his creations are all somehow in a fantasy world that's kind of close to our own world, where you can kind of imagine something fantastical happening within the realm of our world. So when I'm working on the eyes and I'm putting layers on top of each other, as you can see in the middle there is a hole. So what I actually end up doing to make sure that the paper is aligned with the wood piece is that I would actually use like a toothpick, or in this case I use the end of my tweezer to kind of put it into the hole and then kind of rotate it around, because whenever the edge meets the other edge of the layer below, then that side is aligned. So when you're making a circle, eventually you'll have all the circle inner lines be aligned with the bottom layer, and that's how you know that the layers will be aligned. And it actually is two birds with one stone, in the sense of, because you're doing that motion, you're actually getting rid of the excess glue that might have seeped into the hole, making it look like a very clean model. One thing that was a little bit of a challenge for this model was because with the tacky glue that I was using and the amount of glue I was using to glue the two pieces together, I actually had to work in a very short amount of time to make sure things were aligned, because the glue would actually dry out quicker than I realized it would. So I had to make sure that everything was lined really quickly before the glue dried, and that was part of the challenge, just because sometimes it ends up being hard to move around because the glue dried. So when you're working on this, just be aware that you'll be working quickly, sometimes be aligning the pieces together, and you won't have much of a time sometimes, unless you're using a different type of glue. But I actually don't like using the glues that take too long to dry, just because it's hard to move on to the next step when you're layering on top of each other, because you want to make sure that the bottom layer is set in before you add in another layer on top of it. So I would still recommend using something like tacky glue that would dry pretty quickly. Just make sure to work the model or work the piece into its location quickly. Another tip for working on these paper theater models, which I've mentioned in prior builds, is to actually use an X-Acto knife that's really sharp when you're cutting the pieces out of the big piece of paper or the frame. And in this case, it was a little bit tricky just because you actually have to remove wood pieces also from the sheet. So I actually used two different X-Acto knife sets. One was a number 11 blade, which is a normal X-Acto knife that you're used to, and then I also used number 2 blade, which is actually bigger and thicker, which actually helped make it sturdier for when I'm actually cutting down on the wood to separate it out. It's actually not as hard as it sounds, because a lot of the times the wood pieces are connected to each other by a very small little piece, and so what you're really just doing is making sure that you're using the knife to just separate that little connection part. And it usually just means getting your knife and just kind of just going down with the knife on that portion, and it'll snap off, or it will cut off if it's paper. So it is actually very easy. Just the biggest tip I would have is always to make sure that you have a sharp blade. If you're a parent and you want to work on this paper theater series with your children, the only thing I would suggest is that you would actually remove the pieces for them, and then they can actually glue the pieces together. Just because since you are working with a sharp blade, you always want to be careful with children and any sharp objects. So I think this could be a very great collaboration between parents and children, where you can actually spend time together doing these kind of activities, especially during this coronavirus stay at home right now. So I think this is a great activity that you can do together, and actually spend some quality time. So the final part is actually using those tabs to hold all the pieces together in its place. And as you can see, there are gaps between the layers so that you can actually have a perception of depth. This has actually been easy in the wood models just because since it is a rigid piece, it was actually easy to form and connect into the tab itself, while the paper theater, a lot of times I had to fidget around because the paper kept wanting to move. So overall, the wood paper theater series was actually easier to do just because you have that rigidity of the wood itself. There's not much more to say about this build because it was pretty straightforward, and as I said before, it is pretty easy to build. So all I wanted to end this video with is just how simple this build was, and because of the wood grain finish, it actually looks a lot nicer if you especially love wood models. I think this is a great addition to your collection if you like doing wooden models or the paper models, just because it is very unique in the sense of it's not wood or it's not just paper. It's kind of both worlds, and they kind of took advantage of both properties of materials to the maximum advantage. So I would say definitely try working on this series because I really enjoyed it, and I believe I finished this build in about 2 hours, which is actually quick for a paper theater model. And so here we have it. This is the finished model of the W-02 Acorn from the Totoro Ensky paper theaters. And I hope you enjoyed watching this video, and if you like watching this video, please subscribe or watch the other videos that are on my YouTube channel. Thank you.